Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's fantastic panel session. We've got looking at a huge array of issues, all to do with corporate donations to the LGBTQ community. We have a fantastic panelist, but first off, let me just introduce myself. My name's Hugo Greenhalgh, and I'm the editor of Openly, which is the LGBT plus news website from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the charitable arm of Reuters. Now, Openly News, which you can find at openlynews.com, covers issues of legislative and policy shifts from around the world. We have a small team of correspondents based in London, New York, Mexico, and Moscow as well. We also tap into correspondents based in Lagos and New Delhi, and et cetera, But please have a look, again, openlynews.com, end of plug, I promise, and let me know what sort of issues you think we should cover when it comes to the LGBTQ community. But let's look on to the issue of this afternoon, which is looking at whether and how companies are donating to LGBTQ issues. Is there anything wrong with that? The community gains much needed money and the companies gain a new market. And also, let's face it, great PR for seeming to do good. So let's go back to that. Is there something wrong with this? Last year, the world was awash with LGBT sandwiches from Marks and Spencer's or Pride clothing ranges from H&M, River Island, and oddly enough, Calvin Klein. But is this just pinkwashing? By bringing out products for the LGBT community, do companies wrap themselves in the rainbow flag and make us perhaps forget some of the less palatable elements of their corporate behavior? Is it good or is it bad? But if the money stopped, what would happen to events such as Pride, for example? So let's find out. I'm joined today, let me introduce the panelists, fantastic lineup. We've got, in no particular order, Stuart Cameron, who is Group Chief Executive of UHLALA, one of the leading LGBT plus social businesses in Germany. Kristine Garina, who's one of the founders of Riga Pride and now president of European Pride Organisers Association. Maya Bhardwaj, who is the community organizer, musician and artist from Detroit and a member of Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. Next up, we have Josephine Linton, also a fellow activist within the Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants movement, and in her day job, she's a university admin officer. Then Rhammel Afflick, who has a career spanning across the private, public and third sector, and is currently Director of Communications at Pride in London. And then finally, but not least, we have Mark Hanis, one of the founders of Progressive Shopper, which tracks the political contributions made by companies. So that's going to be quite critical to this afternoon's conversation. But before we start, we have a musical performance, fantastic stuff, by Kafayat Kadri, a talented poet and musician from Nigeria. Her music touches on the light-hearted to the serious, but outside her art, Kafayat also has a PhD in international criminal law and is a research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. So before we start, over to you, Kafayat.
Oh, yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Kafayat Kadri and I'm delighted to be supporting All Out and Distance Pride Festival. I'm sending love and light from Nigeria. Happy Pride. Mwah! So I'm going to be singing you guys a song titled The Purpose. So the purpose is supposed to encourage you. Yeah? Never mind the noise in the background, never-ending cussing and battering. Just lift up your body, take a stroll down the street, looking in the faces, 'cause there's a mirror at every corner of our lives. You're truly the best. Just give it another try, another try, another try. Twine, pop bubbles of togetherness, harmlessness, selflessness. These BIDs, milk into butter and cheese. Listen, they say you cannot do it. They know not what they talk about, you see. You have a different purpose and destiny. The world is waiting for you. Be who you want to be. Everyone's writing a story. Take charge and dispose of the frenemies, of the frenemies. This altered honey is not made from bees. Stand well and be well. When I'm entwined, bubbles of togetherness, harmlessness, selflessness. This is not a seven, sweet lemonade from lemon. Entwined bubbles of togetherness, harmlessness, selflessness. This is not a salmon, sweet lemonade from lemon. Yes.
Fantastic stuff. That was really, really lovely, brilliant, and a great way to start this afternoon's panel session. So before we dive straight in, I'm just going to say to people watching that do add your own questions, please do kind of write in. So 2 ways to do that. You can either send the questions into the bottom of the Zoom screen or on the Facebook comments box during the panel discussion. And we will try and answer as many as possible, either during the session as we go on or at the end when we come to the finish. So just to warn you, we had a bit of a dry run yesterday to find out some of the issues and some of the opinions, and it got quite heated already. So I'm quite looking forward to this one. So let's dive straight in with that first pertinent question. Are corporate donations a force for good, or is it just pinkwashing by another name? And Maya, if I could start with you for this one, what's your take on this?
All right, you're starting with a controversial one.
Oh, yes.
Hey, everybody, I'm really happy to be here. Like Hugo mentioned, my name's Maya. I'm an organizer, a community organizer with about 10 years of work in this field in the US, India, Mexico, and now based in the UK, where I'm also a member of LGSM alongside Joe. And so I'm drawing on my experience here as an organizer, as a person of color, as a queer person who identifies as femme, and as a person who works in solidarity with like queer and trans communities kind of transnationally. So for me, the lens that I bring to this organizing work is a very staunchly anti-capitalist lens, as well as an abolitionist lens, plus of course the lens around queerness and queering the organizing that we're doing. So with all that framework, it's impossible for me to imagine a scenario in which corporations' involvement in Pride is a positive thing. I want to start us all off with remembering why Pride exists as a month in the first place, and that is due to police violence that was waged by the American police against Black and Brown, queer and trans communities in New York, and we commemorate this every year on the day often of the riots that occurred, led by Sylvia P. Rivera, Marsha Johnson, and other Black and brown trans women and organizers and queer organizers who were pushing back against this police brutality that they were experiencing. So very, very relevant for the conditions that we're organizing against right now in the US as well as in the UK, around the larger framework of state violence. And
Maya, just to push you to answer the question, because we've got quite a big panel here, but so in terms of just that kind of fundamental question, good or bad, do you think?
Yeah, so I think that context is really important because Pride is a radical act. Being queer and organizing around Pride is a radical act. Corporations funding Pride is not radical. It is a symptom of co-option that like takes our labor and makes it into shiny glitter and rainbows, when the heart of Pride is about resistance to the state, which is a capitalist state, a racialized and racist state, and a queer-phobic state. So for me, yeah, I mean, like, money is great, but the organizing that I do and that we do at LGSM is fundamentally challenging the norms of capitalism and how that's intertwined within homonationalism, queerphobia, and racism. So there's no way in which we can have reform by leveraging the money of corporations, particularly if that funding is coming with strings attached. And I'm okay if Pride doesn't happen as a parade, because it's not a parade, it's an act of resistance in the street.
Fantastic. Well, Maya, thank you very much. We'll come back to you at some point again soon. And just to remind people as well, again, about the questions for the panel session and for the panelists as well, that the Q&A panel is at the bottom of the screen. So do check that out. But Rhammel, if I can come to you just to kind of build on what Maya was saying about that in terms of trying to decommercialize Pride, but also coming back to that fundamental question of looking at corporate donations being a force for good or for bad. Rhammel, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you introduced yourself as controversial, because I think that actually the points you make are important and are valid. And I think it's one of the reasons why, quite often I think it appears that Pride in London, for example, as an organisation, stands still each year, and there are no decisions, and we don't evolve with time and consider the different views within the community. And with that in mind, I think that it means that we do have to be very mindful about the influence of corporates within Pride, because I think it is important that the protest element of Pride is strong and is still there and remains. And there's always been it's always been contentious to talk about whether Pride is a protest or a celebration. I think it has to be both. In terms of whether it can be a force for good or bad, I think there are plenty of examples where corporates across the world, both in the UK and in the US, there are big examples where corporates are taking advantage. I think we have to acknowledge the world that we live within at the moment, and that does mean that in order to deliver work that charities do, quite often corporates have to be involved, and the Pride movement hasn't been different or unique in that circumstance. So we rely on the corporate donations not only to deliver Pride, but also to deliver our festival, which is over 100 events in the lead up to Pride. We rely on it to deliver things like Pride's Got Talent, which is our talent program, which means that a large percentage of the talent that we have on the stages of Pride in London on the day are people from within our community. So whilst I think that quite often we talk specifically about the parade and the protest element, it has wider ramifications than perhaps just the day itself, because obviously, as whilst I think that these things are, it's important that these issues don't get lost. Quite often, it's supporting infrastructure for loads of other things. So whether that's other protests that we want to organise, etc. So I think that's an important context.
Exactly. It's not just Pride. There's a whole kind of ramifications for the events, the run up, etc., etc. But Kristine, if I can bring you in at this point to perhaps kind of build on what Rhammel was saying, obviously from the perspective of the European Pride Organisers Association, what Rhammel was saying about the infrastructure, the build up, is that something you recognise as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think just thinking of the question, is it good or bad? It depends what we as Pride organisers do with it and how we direct this relationship between Pride and the corporate world. And we have the power that we don't always recognize that we have and that we don't always use. And if we work as like one movement and keep the solidarity in the center of Pride, then largest Prides like London, like Madrid, like Copenhagen, they have the power to ask companies the difficult questions. So you want to sell your product to the community here. Well, who doesn't want to sell their beer or their vodka at Pride in London or Pride in Copenhagen? But what are you doing in Poland? What your corporation doing in Hungary? Are you supporting your LGBT employees in Russia? So there's a huge power to make other LGBTQI people's lives better in different regions and connecting corporations to reality. So we just need to make sure that we're using this power, and then we can change this relationship.
Stuart, when you and I spoke with the rest of the group yesterday, we talked about trying to find some sort of balancing both the good and the bad. So is there some way we can strike a balance, do you think, between the two sides here?
I think there's...
Oh, sorry, this is for Stuart, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was still for me, sorry.
Sorry, Kristine. Yeah, I think it's good. It's good and bad. And what Kristine said, it depends on the relationship. There are companies that are doing it for pinkwashing and are just trying to sell the products, and there are other companies that are really supporting the movement, especially because most companies, when they are part of the prides, this always comes up from the LGBT people within a company. And I think, yes, on the one side, they can have like a better image or can sell more products, but if they're really honest and they're really taking care of what LGBT plus people in their company and outside, it can really make a difference. And especially like not for countries like ours, like here in Germany or in the UK or the United States, this is good. And we have like millions of people here walking the street, but for people in different countries where it's not like a happy pride and it's very dangerous and you get beaten up and it's like, it's very, very, very dangerous. It's great if you have then companies there who are also going on the street and showing, no, this is okay, this is important. And also especially for the LGBT plus community in those countries, they are always telling me when they see like a Berlin Pride and there are like 1 million people and there are also companies marching there, this gives them also hope. So it's yes, for us maybe in Berlin more it's a celebration, but in other countries it's more a demonstration. And I think it can be good, but I see also again, like what Maya said, and Joe, I guess, there are also a lot of difficulties. And I think it's important that if we work together with companies in the Pride season and also before and after, because we are LGBT the whole year round, then we should make sure that the companies are really taking it serious, and especially that we know they are focusing also on their LGBT plus employees. And if they don't do it, then it shouldn't be part of the Pride.
Well, absolutely. And I don't want to get sidetracked too much into whether Pride is a parade or is a protest or a party, but I think that's pretty much kind of fundamental to this discussion. But Joe, just to kind of come back to you at this point, in terms of looking at that notion, are corporate donations at any point acceptable, do you think?
At any point, like I understand that, you know, like community organizing charities need to raise money from somewhere. I get it. I just think we have to, if products are being sold and marketed in our name as queer people, we have to like really ask what it is that we're supporting. So I think Maya really articulated the like important point for me that Pride is about, you know, resilience. And like to just highlight a couple of companies that are currently giving their money to Prides and therefore using the queer struggle as a marketing tool, basically. One of them is British Airways, which is a main sponsor of Brighton Pride that we've done a lot of work campaigning against, because British Airways actually deport migrants on their commercial flights, which is something that a lot of people don't know about British Airways actually as a brand, because their brand image is very much one of sort of like liberal, progressive British values, which is in a large part built on their support for the LGBTQ community through events like Pride. So yeah, their support for us at Pride is kind of uses this like veneer to cover up the really sort of regressive policies that they're.
So it's classic pinkwashing is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, they sort of use a diluted down version of the queer struggle basically as a way to cover up the really terrible things they do. You know, their complicity with the hostile environment violence against migrants.
Just to come back to my initial question, are there any circumstances under which corporate donations are acceptable, do you think?
You know what, it's hard to say things are 100%. Would I ever think that a company like British Airways or Barclays making donations as a marketing ploy is okay? Absolutely not. If there's if there's like a local coffee shop who's giving money to something, and you don't really think they've done anything evil, like, for sure, I don't think I would personally have a problem with that sort of donation. But...
No, fair enough. And Mark, let's throw this out to you in that case, looking at Progressive Shopper in particular, because obviously you track the ways in which companies donate to politicians. Now, companies might be, sponsoring pride parades and out there and fluffy and lovely and, doing some great stuff. But on the other side, they might also be handing funds, cash, donations to politicians who are actively working against the LGBTQ community. So is it a matter of pinkwashing? Is it a matter of hypocrisy?
So there's certainly the pinkwashing and hypocrisy. I think there's a continuum on how companies are responding to LGBTQ rights and other social issues. They're either complicit or complacent. And then there are some categories which we want as many actors in every sector is to be a partner, to be cooperative and constructive. And then we've seen companies do amongst that continuum well internally and terrible externally. But there are some of those companies that are trying to do good on both their internal policies and then their external. So we've seen companies that do a phenomenal job at trying to hire, empower, not discriminate against members of the LGBTQ community, but then they're donating millions of dollars to politicians who think that gay marriage should be outlawed, are trying to oppose in the US members of the LGBTQ community from serving in the military. And so that's not consistent. It's easy for any person to look at that company as pinkwashing. And so what we're asking is for companies to ensure every angle that they are engaged on every social issue to be as consistent and constructive as possible.
Well, let's try and wrap this all together in that case. In terms of looking at what Kristine and Rhammel have said, also Stuart and Joe and Maya as well, is it about context? Is it about looking at the background of those companies that make the donations and then trying to establish really whether you take the money or not? Stuart, I think you had your hand up at this point. What's your take?
Yes, I think because we are working now since 11 years, like with the LGBT community together, we're trying to bring together like LGBT friendly companies and LGBT people, because also here in Germany, there are not like hundreds of companies that are open. Most companies still have a problem with it and they don't want to do anything to do with LGBT people, or at least they don't say anything. Yeah, but it's not that so many people, companies really want to support it. And I think it's very, so when we are also like looking into the companies who we're going to work with, there was always like a question of, okay, can I work with a company together like Coca-Cola, which is like so big and capitalistic and doing like pollution to the world, etc. And then on the other side, you see they do so many things for the LGBT plus people within the company. And I know so many of the LGBT plus people there. They're really like, when I see what they did for 5 years and what they're doing now and what it changes with the minds, etc., or when I see those companies going to countries where it's very dangerous and they're very public and do advertisement, and then the young LGBT people see it there, so wow, I'm not that weird, I'm not alone, and there I can see like there's going to be good times there in the future. So it was very hard for me to decide which company I will work. And then we talk about it for a very long time, because I have very left people in my company, like really super left. They don't like a lot of the companies we're working to, but they agreed on one thing. If we can say, if the company works towards LGBT people with everything, and not like what Mark's saying, yeah, on the one side they're doing that, but on the other side they're giving money to politicians they are fighting against us, then we don't work with them together. But if they are pro-LGBT, then we say, okay, we really work with you, because we cannot like we cannot like do everything in the world and like in saving everything on the planet. We don't have this power, but we have the power at least to make a change in companies, and really trying to bring this LGBT plus people who are looking for like an LGBT friendly environment where they can work, because they also need money to live for, at least provide them like a stage where they can see those are the companies, they're really for you there. They accept you. They're not just accepting or tolerating you, but they're appreciating you. And
no, exactly. And that's a very fair point and very well made. But I just want to bring in Rhammel at this point. I mean, Rhammel, when we spoke yesterday as well, you also mentioned that obviously corporate donors come to Pride in London. They offer money. Fantastic. But you don't always say yes, do you?
Well, no, and sometimes I consider whether we should be more public about that, because I think there is a perception, perhaps. I don't know how each Pride organizer works, but we certainly have become a lot more considered in the partnerships that we take on, and there've been some companies offering quite significant amounts of money that we've had to say no on, not necessarily because of how they treat LGBT employees, but because of some of the other issues that we're concerned about. And so one of the things that I think Pride organizers will need to continue to think about and reflect on is what those values look like. So for example, the values that guide participation in the parade for corporates, etc. I think one of the things that we are looking at now that we haven't had a parade this year is what do those values look like, and how can we really strengthen them so that we can be really sure that actually it isn't a company or an organization that is contributing to racism in the world, or upholding racism in the world in some way proactively, because there are other issues that I think we have to consider, particularly because we know these are communities, and that's one of the things that we're trying to move away from talking about, the LGBT community, but actually LGBT communities, because we're not homogenous. And that was one of the reasons I got involved in Pride, was because I felt that actually we do need to redress the balance. Traditionally, for quite some time, the Pride movement has been presented in the most homogenous way. It's about white cisgendered gay men, and it's far broader than that. And for me, I want those experiences represented across the board. But in order for that to happen, in order for people to feel they can participate, it means that we might have to start considering more when we involve people, but also looking at the percentages of participation as well. So for example, for us, it's really important that the community hearts front and center, and that includes who's at the front of the parade, but also the percentage of corporates that are in the parade. I think those things are all really important and imperative if we're going to ensure that the politics really does stay at the heart of Pride.
And actually, one thing before I come on to Maya, but Rhammel, one last question for you. Very, very quick answer, please. But one stat that came up yesterday was quite interesting in terms of the corporate donors and the number of floats percentage-wise for Pride. What's the actual percentage number? Oh, you're just on mute, sorry.
So it's about 36% at the moment, which is probably not the perception of Pride. I think people think it is.
Well, I think people think it's a lot higher, don't they?
But also, I think there's sometimes the perception that it's their marketing teams that are walking through the parade. Actually, it's more often than not, the passionate LGBT people who actually they want their company, because whether they may not, they could be anti-capitalist. No one knows what those people's views are, but they work for a company, and they want to show up and say,
well, I'm going to leave that.
I believe in LGBT.
If I may, and just come on to Maya at this point, and just ask, just to build on what Stuart was saying about the fact that at times, and in certain countries around the rest of the world, this money is necessary to actually get people on the streets, to actually kind of afford and be able to demonstrate, not necessarily to have a party, but actually to get out there, basically. And I wonder, is this a kind of a luxury in the global West, this type of argument we were having, where if we were in countries such as Russia, or which are really antithetical to LGBTQ rights, where the money could really do some good?
I think it's a good question to ask about the ways in which the conversations are distinct between the global North and the global South. I think as a queer person who's worked as an organizer both in India and Mexico, as well as in the US and the UK, the conversations have definitely been different. But I think I would lift up the experience that I had supporting queer and feminist organizing in Mexico, in which the anti-capitalist stance was even more firm than I have seen in the US or the UK, in that folks are really comfortable and really clear about drawing the lines around who we are accepting support from, and the way in which we're keeping our movements firm in a holistic way. And I actually see much less of these conversations that, you know, like mirror the framework of the nonprofit industrial complex about like, but can we accept funding from this corporation or another? Whereas our comrades on the ground in the majority of the global South are doing that work on the daily basis without the luxury of paid jobs or institutionalized organizations that are funding their work. Would I love a world in which all organizers are getting stipended for the labor that they put in? Absolutely, yes. But would I also love a world in which corporations like Barclays and Coke cease to exist, in which like the state of Israel cannot pinkwash its genocide of Palestinian people by saying like, come to Tel Aviv Pride? Like, yes, I would also like for that second scenario to see.
Well, let's throw this question over to Kristine in that case. I mean, Kristine, say tomorrow we banned corporate donations to any kind of, you know, LGBTQ organization, Pride, the event, the parade, the run-up. What would happen?
Well, I'm sure some events and some protests and some marches could still happen, but what we would lose is an opportunity for a huge part of the community who need to come together during Pride. And for some, it is the only chance to be amongst the community and be a part of LGBTQI community. Obviously not everyone, and we still need to work to open up for more people, but that would actually exclude the debates, the discussions that we have, film nights, whatever free spaces we have for the community to come together, that will be lost. And obviously also in many places, Pride organization also do other work. In many countries, there's just one organization that does everything. And that would actually also affect the work through the year, and the support groups, legal help, that would also suffer. So I think we would still be able to have a protest and a march, I'm sure, but everything else that has grown around Pride that was done by the community and the large part of the community needs, that would be lost.
And Joe, to come to you, to bounce this off you at this point, I mean, we in London on Saturday had two marches, one by the Gay Liberation Front, which is a 70s activist group here in the UK, and secondly one for Black Trans Lives Matter, both of which were extremely well attended and no corporate sponsors. So do we need the money to get out and really make our mark, basically?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think those two examples that you've just raised, like, absolutely prove that we don't. So that, yeah, this weekend, the Black Trans Lives Matter protest on the Saturday, which Maya and I were at, it was such a like beautiful event of you know, people coming together to stand up for the most marginalized members of our community, to you know, really make a political intervention, to take a stand against like police brutality, state violence, against, you know, the Conservative government's proposal to ignore the reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, like all really vital struggles for us to be participating in at the moment. And you know that, yeah, there's not a corporation in sight. If you're planning a parade or a protest, you have to pay the city for permits. You have to get money for that. This is how corporations get involved, and what you end up with having, as we see in like most of the major Pride events, is just a sort of a spectacle of advertising, whereas you remove that, like the community still comes together.
Well, let's follow up on that point, if I may. Mark, we'll come to you in 1 second, but Rhammel, I think you wanted to just jump in at that point.
Yeah, I did, because I think that protests and what happened on Saturday, and I was there, and it was really emotional. And I went with some of the other Black and Brown volunteers at Pride in London, because, by the way, we are volunteers. I probably should have explained that at the beginning. So, you know, I'm not being paid to do it in my free time, sometimes up till 2 a.m. doing all sorts. But I think what happened on Saturday is really important, and there has to be a space for those protests to happen. There were things and messages that need to be said, including some of the messages that were probably directed at Pride in London themselves. I agree that those protests are really important. And one of the things that I think is really interesting that isn't often acknowledged is also the accessibility of protests and the format for protests. So, for example, we talk about how the protests happened, and we didn't need all of the infrastructure that comes with Pride in London, for example. But we forget that actually there was so much more than just the protest. The protest is a central part of it, an important part of it, which is why I mentioned the balance earlier. But for example, there were provisions that we put on at Pride in London that you can't put on in a protest. So for example, we do a lot actually to really ensure that there's a space, an inclusive space for those with disabilities. You can't do that in a protest. The platform that we gave to Black and Brown people last year in Golden Square, which was completely curated by our Black and Brown volunteers and our partners. Again, a massive stage. Those spaces don't come out of nowhere. We have UK Black Pride, for example, in the UK, but we don't really have many of those other spaces. So for me, it's not that the protest element can't happen. Of course it can and it should happen, and we shouldn't wait for Pride. If there needs to be a protest next week, let's have it. And Pride would be more than happy to help with that.
We'll come back to that.
We don't acknowledge those wider ramifications. It's not just the parade, it's like it's all the other bits that come with
exactly it. And we'll come back to that perhaps as a final question at the end in terms of parade, party, protest, etc., etc. But let's move on. Mark, just looking at one of the questions we've just got in from the audience, and if I can bounce this one off you in particular, but I mean, are corporations per se the problem, or is the issue how the corporation engages, not just in Pride, but with the LGBT community in general?
Yeah, I think as we've talked, a lot of folks have shared, like we shouldn't treat the community as a homogenous entity. There's lots of different people with different needs and different aspects that they're dealing with. I would say the same thing with corporations. There isn't a homogenous corporation. We've got the small coffee shops. There's lots of businesses that are run by LGBTQ members that are trying to do their best to ensure that they're paying, they're recruiting, they're promoting members of the LGBTQ community so they can provide them the resources to do whatever they want to do. And so I wouldn't put everything in the same corporate bucket. And the same thing to your question, Hugo, is that there's the events that we talk about this month, but there's, as Stuart said, there's 365. So there's all the 11 other months where companies are behaving badly in many cases, being neutral, which is not enough. And then there are some companies that are sort of leading the way and doing the right thing in ensuring their internal policies and systems, but also how they engage with governments, other companies, other nonprofits, individuals. And what we're trying to say is companies need to move to that continuum where they are consistent in their internal, external behavior, so that they are allies, as wherever, however possible we want them to be. I want to avoid saying that all companies are the same and that it's only about this month and it's only about events. So if a company is discriminating against its employees the 11 months out of the year, but it promotes, it's giving money, it's happy not to take any of the brand recognition, that's not good enough. If it's doing 100% internally, but then donating to members of Congress who are passing explicit policies to discriminate against LGBTQ people, it's not enough. So I think what we're trying to do is let's unpack all the different ways we want companies to behave, and let's try to get them to the way where we want them to be. And we're going to shame them, we're going to incentivize them. And if and how we want them to be partners in these events, that's up for the organizers and all the different communities to make that determination.
I think that's absolutely right. I think, also the LGBTQ community has its own soft power in that sense, being able to influence the corporations to change, not just the other way around, as it were.
Companies, there's an incentive today than ever before. Companies are saying, we want to put the rainbow flag colors on our branding. We want to show that we are engaged in this community in a positive way. And that's where I think that power is. And the organizers saying it's not good enough. If you're donating to these politicians, we don't want you, or we're going to exclude you. And that's crazy powerful.
Well, before I open up to questions from the floor, I just want to ask one quick question for everyone. We've kind of established what the issue is. We've heard kind of both sides and the middle ground as well. But let's see if we can forge a solution. Is there a balance? And if so, what is the right balance? And perhaps, Kristine, if I could start with you this time around, in terms of asking that, does one mix corporate donations with asking for something in return, ensuring, as Mark and Stuart and others have said, about there's an employment policy in place at that particular company? What is the right balance, do you think?
Obviously, we need to filter out the companies, and lots of things were mentioned what needs to be considered. But even with that, I think balance is stop selling advertisement and starting building relationships with these corporations. So what we can do is switch from marketing budget to their diversity and social responsibility budgets. And instead of selling advertising space on floats, it's not about that anymore, and it shouldn't be. But with that comes the relationship that is long-term and investment into other groups, other issues that otherwise wouldn't get any attention. So it's up to us to build those relationships and change them from marketing to purely meaningful diversity relationship that we build in long terms with those corporations. And that would be how you actually say that this is not pinkwashing. You cannot buy advertisement with us. You can only engage in long-term support to Pride, but also to other community groups.
No, absolutely fair point. And Joe, if I perhaps can come to you next and look at that kind of sense of a healthy balance whereby we accept corporate donations, but we have strings, we have conditions that we want from you. Is that something that would be acceptable, do you think?
I think for me personally, I think there's a difference between if we're talking about sort of Pride events or other things. Like if you're a queer activist or community group or charity and you need to get funding from some places, and you might accept funding that's like grants from companies or whatever. We have to get the work done somehow. When it comes to Pride events, I would like to see a Pride that is just completely free of corporations, that just is not an advertising space at all. I don't think it's a space. I don't think it's a marketing ploy. I don't think it's a platform for companies to advertise their products, to sort of co-opt the queer narrative as a marketing tactic. I would like corporations completely out of Pride events altogether, really.
Nope.
Return it to its roots.
Go back to its roots. Stuart, is there a balance that we can strike in terms of, again, that not necessarily half and half, 75-25, but ensuring that the people on the streets are happy with the companies being involved and the company themselves know what the rules are?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's necessary to, as I said before, not just for us, but also for the other LGBT people around the world to see it. But I think we really have to make sure that these companies are really taking the issue serious. Really, if they're not just here for the Pride season, when they're changing their logo into rainbow colors, I cannot see it anymore if they don't take it seriously. I want to see a year ongoing relationship, and also they're really pushing this agenda, not just in countries where it's like happy and nice and it's easy and you don't lose customers, but go please, especially with the big companies who are operating around the world. Come on, okay, show there your rainbow colors, yeah, and pick up the fight there, because they're so much more harder. But I think, yes, we need them because they have power, and I'm very practical. I want to see change. I want to see that all LGBT people around the world, that there's no prison anymore, and they can go on the streets holding hands. And if this means that we need bigger companies with their power, etc., but they're on our side, I'm happy, because there are other politicians, etc., they're not on our side, and I will fight against this. So like, if they want to help us, yes, but let's have like some rules there, making sure that the money goes really to the LGBT plus community, and not just like to rent some space for the demonstration or for the catering. Yes. So
exactly. And and Rhammel, not to really put Pride in London in the firing line here, but in terms of balance, do you think you've got the balance right at the moment?
No, I don't. I think we still have to do more to balance things out, and I think that over the last 2 years we've made some real progress on that. So, for example, we're far less reliant, for example, on our corporate donors than we were 3 years ago. So we've really tried to diversify our income. But the thing that's really stayed at the centre for us is that participation in Pride, in and across the way what we deliver is free. So whether you attend one of our stages, etc., if you attend, it's free. But we're also working on something called our Unity Fund, which is for us about really funding grassroots projects. For the first time ever, we've been in a position, because again, people think we attract millions. We don't. We just about get enough to deliver the event. And so we're for the first time, we're in the position to actually do that. And we're not funding large charities. So whilst there's great charities like Stonewall doing amazing work for LGBT people, this will be about funding some of those grassroots projects. Some of you might even disagree with Pride in London. But and that work will be imperative because of the way that we've diversified our funding. So I think we still need to do more to do that, to make sure that we don't appear to be reliant on corporates, but that there is a place for them to a role for them to play at this current time, because in order for us to really have a moment in time where people can, because this is centered around people, this is about having a moment to not only protest and be angry about the things, the Gender Recognition Act, all of those things, but also to celebrate in some ways. And I don't mean to celebrate what we've got, but to celebrate just being able to exist and to share a moment together. And all of those they're important. So for me, I don't think we're completely over the line. But in the last 2 years, we certainly, even participation in the parade, as I mentioned, is transformed in those times. So yeah, I think we've still got far further to go. So
very much a work in progress. But Mark, your company, Progressive Shopper, very much kind of tracks those donations. But can we ever truly know, not necessarily where the money's coming from, yeah, we can do that bit, but in terms of truly know what the company is actually involved in other bits, which are maybe around the world or maybe underhand? I mean, is there any sense of transparency here at all when it comes to corporate donations?
I don't know if there's 100% transparency, especially in the US context, which I'm more familiar with. There's dark money, so there's sometimes they'll give it to intermediaries who are advancing some of the negative policies. I like the medical standard of do no harm. I don't know where the right balance is, but if a company is complicit or complacent in structural discrimination and oppression, I think we can at least say definitively, though, that's not good enough. Now, I agree with Stuart, like we also know what the ceiling, like just changing your avatar once a month, 1 month out of the year, that's not good enough. It's in that gray zone of, if you're doing no harm, but we want you to be a positive agent for change, where and how is that, are those criterias in order to be met? You can donate money, but you'll never get any brand recognition. That could be some of it, because it costs money to put some of these events, to allow people to participate. So I think that's up to, it's not for me to decide. I'd leave that to the organizers in the local context. But I do think we could at least agree that just doing marketing is not enough, and being part of the problem, especially in a systemic structural way of doing harm, is not enough. So that's where I would put the range, the zone of finding that balance.
And Maya, to come to you for this one as well, in terms of picking up on Mark's point about do no harm, is there any instance you think when a corporate donation could do no harm? Is there a balance that could be struck?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly quite difficult for me to think of one in which there was no harm done. I think we talked about the example earlier of like a local coffee shop that's a hub for the queer community. For me, that's not a corporation though, right? That's a community business. And I think we need to think more broadly than whether corporations are just like explicitly discriminating against queer people. The framework of most corporates, and the reason that they have profit is because they don't pay their workers enough, right? Like the nature is that the boss makes more money under capitalism, hence they are able to make large donations to queer communities. But if instead they just paid their workers a living wage, then maybe we as individuals would have more purchasing power to individually donate to the queer or otherwise organizations in our communities that we'd like to support. So like, I don't think it's enough for us to say like, okay, the structure of capitalism and worker exploitation is okay if you're able to funnel that excess profit towards queer organizations one day a year. Like for me, the fundamental structure of capitalism and worker exploitation, which affects queer people as well as people of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, etc., that is inherent to the system of like donation that we have within the nonprofit industrial complex. So I'm not saying like local business cannot support the movement. Of course they can, but it's very difficult for me to envision a corporation that doesn't use those systems of exploitation.
Well, let's look at, and this is a question now from the audience, and it's quite a good idea if nothing else, but this is from Drew, and a possible solution to what we were talking about in terms of balance and rules of engagement with companies. Drew asks, many of the organizations who support many large pride events are transnational organizations. They very often tend to only support prides in the global north or west. If we are to involve them, could they not be forced to pay for pride events and organizations in the global south? Food for thoughts. Stuart, do you want to pick this one up?
I'm always for more money into our community. So yes, of course. And I think.
But would it work if you turned around to a corporation and said, right, we'll take your cash, but we're going to demand you give some money to Pride elsewhere? Is that feasible?
Yes and no. The problem is that those companies, even if you think they're like these big companies and everybody knows each other, like most of they don't know each other so much. Yeah. So like big companies, like, I don't know, the people working for Google here in Germany, they don't talk so much with the people in Silicon Valley. And they have also like different policies with LGBT people, etc. I would love to see it more. And I see some companies there doing it, but not, okay, we do it here and then we have to do it there. This is just like a principle. We want to do it everywhere. We want to celebrate it in all our offices around the world, but this is not all companies. And yes,
exactly.
I wish it's they would do it. And I think I really believe that our Pride organizations here in the West should maybe really work closer together with the one.
Well, let's ask that question. Kristine, you're absolutely at the kind of, at the center of this, not just in terms of the European Pride Organiser Association, but also as one of the co-founders of Riga Pride. Just to start with that question first about trying to force or ask, or whatever the way could work, organizations, companies rather, that would fund Global North Prides to also look at Global South. Would that actually work in practice, first of all?
Well, it wouldn't work in practice if me and Riga would go to a corporation that supports London and say, listen, here, look at them. The other way around, it may, but we have to start working on it and not just support. We can't ask them pay for Pride somewhere else. It's more broader, support LGBTI movement, whatever local community or organizations think is suitable. So just support the movement, and that I think can be done through the conversations. And this is what I've been trying to tell, was change the relationship into this long-term global cooperation rather than just sponsorship to one event. And I think it's doable. We just have to all start doing it.
And in terms of Stuart's point about kind of Pride organizations working more closely together, Kristine, stick with you. They're already doing that, aren't they, or are they not?
We are working together. I think Pride organizations actually are very strong in networking and in solidarity and in helping each other. And just the whole European solidarity that came from Pride organization when the troubles hit Poland, that was such a great example how the Pride movement just come together and can do great things. So I do think that this is totally possible for us to come together and do this and build this relationship as a corporate sector together as one huge network, and then our power would be even bigger. I think it's already big because we have the large part of community behind us. So actually coming together and doing these conversations as a network is very, very powerful.
It's interesting, Joe, just come to you next with this one in terms of looking at that, setting those sort of rules of engagement, as it were. So therefore you give us something, we get something back, but also we ensure that those prides around the world in countries which again might have anti-LGBTQ laws or a much more oppressive society. Would that be something you would back, perhaps?
I mean, as I said already, I'm really not on board with corporate involvement in Pride events at all. But I mean, I'm kind of pessimistic about companies saying yes to sponsoring prides in in countries where homophobia is more rife than it is here, or countries with less spending power. I mean, we have to remember that Pride hasn't been fought for and won by corporations. Like we are where we are today with the rights and freedoms we enjoy because of like the hard work of queer activists over the last 50 years and longer. Corporations only jumped on the bandwagon once queerness was like more socially acceptable and therefore more sellable. I just really don't think that, I don't really think any corporations are going to be leading the charge for queer rights in countries where that's not already so much of a thing.
Well, I can see, Rhammel, you're raising your hand. I was just going to come to you next. Absolutely. I mean, from your own experience in terms of Pride in London, would it work? Could it work? Does it work?
Okay, so there's 2 points. I'll be really quick. There's 2 points I think to be made. One, I think that prides should always use the power that they have to leverage corporates to do things. And there have been occasions where Pride in London, I think, has done that. There have been times when we've had to, unfortunately, call out our partners publicly if we felt something has been wrong. So I think this leveraging our power is definitely something we, you know, I wouldn't, we were going to actively do that if we needed to. But there's a second bit to it, and I find it slightly troubling, because I think that, unfortunately, you know, even within British society, quite often there's this kind of saviour complex, and so we're really, really careful about how we pride globally. So of course we want to support Pride globally, but it has to be something that is helpful to the Pride organisers on the ground. And so whilst, you know, whilst it's conducive to us as a, you know, as a, in some respects that we're in some ways rebalancing wealth in some ways and utilising the resources that those corporates have to deliver our Pride, that might not be helpful somewhere else. And so I think that that's really important. It doesn't matter what the context is, even when we're just putting out a statement that's about something happening elsewhere in the world, we just have to be really careful that it's actually helpful to the activists on the ground. Otherwise, I just don't think that's the right way to go about it. So just because it seems right and it maybe is going to make people feel better, I don't think it means we should do it.
If
Maya, yes, exactly. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it's also important for us to move away from the framework of Pride as the most important thing that happens around queer organizing throughout a year or throughout any given amount of time. Like, I think for some activists in some spaces, Pride is very important, and I'm not diminishing the experience of that, but I think I can't speak to the needs, the financial needs, and also organizing needs of activists on the ground working with communities who may be homeless or who may be disproportionately affected by COVID, or who may be experiencing loss of work, or for folks who are in precarious work like sex work, or are experiencing like many different intersections within the framework of being queer. I don't know that organizers would necessarily say that like the most important money to come in is to go towards a Pride celebration or resistance or what have you. So I think it's also important for us to be thinking about how are we funding the ongoing work of queer organizing groups and community spaces that exist throughout the year, and divest from the framework of like Pride is the most important thing as a parade every June or July.
Just to come back at this point, I'm just going to go to Mark next, but Maya, just one question for you. I see that kind of Salesforce, for example, funded Eswatini Pride last year. What do you make of that?
You know, I'll just be frank, I'm not super familiar with the like intricacies of the work of Salesforce, so I wouldn't want to speak to that, nor do I really know the conditions on the ground with that.
Fair enough.
So I would love to pass the mic to an organizer from that space if they were present with us, but I wouldn't want to speak on their behalf.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Mark, I see you want to jump in at this point.
Yeah, so I love Joe's point. It's rare are revolutions or social justice struggles led by corporations. Rarely, if any time, they are. But I would encourage that they're a pretty powerful sector or entity that to dismiss them or disengage them seems to be a disservice. So I think the question should be, how do we strategically engage or not with corporations? So if we don't want them part of certain events, so be it. If we want them to do other things, we're going to ask them for that. And I'm just going to use Salesforce in North Carolina in the US. A lot of companies, one of Salesforce was very prominent to say, we will not build any more office spaces or invest any more money in North Carolina when they were debating banning discrimination on transgender people. And a lot of times people say that, but for the private sector in supporting, not being the leader, but being an ally in that fight, there are certain policymakers who said, wow, we're going to lose a lot of revenue from the private sector. We are going to maybe water it down or maybe not do it, depending on that range. So I think sometimes engaging the private sector is worthwhile considering.
And I will come back to that because I think just seeing a question from the floor on exactly that topic. So I just want to go to Stuart and then come back to that topic. But Stuart, you wanted to come in this point?
Yes. By the way, how long is this going? I thought till 7.
Until yeah, exactly. So we're just on the very last question.
Okay, good. So I think it was very important what was Maya saying is that there is not just Pride, and Pride is like not just Pride Month for a lot of companies. It's just one day, and sometimes they invest. I know they invest 40,000 euros or more money for one day. And we're always saying, hey, with this kind of money, you can support so many LGBT organizations that would be so happy, and they can work for because they don't need so much money, and a lot of people doing it in their free time. So like, please invest more, not just in this one day, but throughout the year in different organizations, especially the ones you don't see, like especially like me, I'm white, cis, gay man. I have so much privilege, and I get so much more easy like income, or I get visibility. But for to my trans friends, there are also here organizations, and they are so hard to get money because they're not that visible. And for companies right now with the pride, we're on the streets and everybody sees us and so on. And I'm like, why, like, Coca-Cola, great, but why not just your LGBT people from your network should be there? Yeah, so that Coca-Cola stand is very, very small. But this is just one idea. But I think it's important. Pride is not the most important thing in life, and we can protest without any companies. We see it with COVID now, etc. It works, but let's don't fight them on this issue when they want to help us. Bring them inside, so they, even if they don't lead the change, but it can help us to make the change faster. So like a little bit practical, but still know where we came from, and we still have to do the lead.
Absolutely, and I'm very conscious of the time. I'm going to ask a very quick fire question to all of you at this point. So I want a yes and a sentence, and if there's any more than that, I will cut you off. But so let's go back to the crux of the matter, which obviously we're talking about corporate donations, but also at the base of this is really what everyone's asking: what is Pride? What's Pride for? Is it a party? Is it a protest? Or can it be both? Joe, let's kick off with you. And again, very, very short, please.
Sure, it can be a party, but only if it's also a protest, if it resists state violence, it stands up for the most marginalized members of our community and in society in general. Yeah.
Fantastic. Kristine.
Well, Pride is whatever the community wants it to be at that point in that city, and just take it and run with it and change it if it needs to be changed. It can be all of the things, whatever is needed for the community, wherever it is at that time.
Mark, what's your take on this?
To use a Hamilton phrase, it's a moment of a larger movement.
Fantastic. Stuart.
After this shit, I want it to be everything, because I want that it's a party, because I want that we celebrate the fuck out of it. But I also want to have it as it's a demonstration, and it's a demonstration for all of us, because this is really what we need to change right now, not just for this one part of the LGBT community. There are others we have to make sure they are more visible than the others.
And Maya, what's your opinion?
I think Pride is a moment for us to reimagine the world that we want to live in. It's a moment of revolution, it's a moment of protest, but there's also joy and there's beauty and liberation within that.
Fantastic. And Rhammel, for the final word, not just in the context of Pride alone, but your own personal opinion?
In my own personal opinion, if I'm honest, from my own personal view, I lean towards protest because I'm angry about society. But when we did some research on this, it was clear that both were quite important to the community. And even when I think about my own activism, I've been fighting for a lot of the things I care about for 15 years. It gets very depressing. It's upsetting. There are issues that I've spoken about on racism, on biphobia in our communities for a long time. And actually, sometimes it is nice to have that moment to celebrate just with other queer people that are doing amazing things year round. To whether that's about, platforming talent, all of those things, that to me is a part of it too, because otherwise, if I'm honest with you, the rest of the year it's really sad. Even the stuff on the GRA, I just get so angry that we're potentially in a moment where things might regress for trans people. It's shocking, it's astonishing, it shouldn't be happening. So I'm angry the rest of the year. So it's nice sometimes, I guess, to have one day. I actually cried last year because just because it is emotional, and it has to be a celebration in some respects, as I say, just because the rest of the year sometimes it's just one angry moment in itself. So yeah.
Fantastic. And that's a brilliant way to end this really fantastic panel session. So just to say thank you again to the panelists, Maya, Rhammel, Christina, Stuart, Joe, and Mark. Thank you very much to all of you as well who've been watching and for your excellent questions as well. Sorry not to squeeze you all in this afternoon, but I'm sure we'll come back to the subject again. But once again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.